He farms 40 acres in the small town of Selma, California, and he's just published what may be the best history of the Second World War that you will ever read. Victor Davis Hanson joining us today. Uncommon Knowledge, now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. A classicist and historian, Victor Davis Hanson is a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, where he serves as editor of Strategika, a journal of military history and contemporary conflict. Dr. Hanson is the author of many books, including the classic study of the Peloponnesian War, A War Like No Other. Dr. Hanson's newest book, The Second World Wars, How the First Global Conflict Was Fought and Won. Victor, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's begin at the beginning. This S, the Second World Wars, why is there a plural in the title?
I think for two reasons. One is that from 1939, when Germany divided up Poland with the Soviet Union, till April of 41, there was a Polish war, there was a Norwegian war, there was a Danish war, there was a Low Country war, there was a French war, there was the Blitz, there was the Yugoslavian war, there was a Greek war. And all of those together really weren't called the Second World Wars or World War II. They were seen as isolated border blitzkriegs in which Germany, with the exception of the Blitz, won every one of them. And then something weird happened. In 1941, Germany preempted and invaded its de facto ally, the Soviet Union, on June 22nd of 1941. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Malaysia and Singapore on the next day and brought Japan in the war, not just against us, but against Britain too. And then nobody thought on December 11th, Italy and Germany would declare war on us. And suddenly these border wars that nobody really knew what they were renamed the Second World War. And because it really was in Asia and in North Africa, even in the Americas, in the sense of off the coast of South America, and there was a submarine campaign, and suddenly they were plural. And then the other thing was, of course, nobody had ever fought a war where it was so disparate. I mean, you're fighting in the desert in armor. You're under 500 feet of water in the North Atlantic. You're 20,000 feet above Germany in a British bomber. You're fighting in Burma. You're one of the 15 million people that were probably killed in China. So it was so disconnected. What did somebody who was fighting in Bulgaria have to do with the Japanese fighting in China? And yet nominally they were on the same Axis side. So it was trying to capture that ambiguity. It's not a monolithic, easily comprehended war.
How it began. I'm quoting again from the Second World Wars. The Axis powers were completely ill-prepared to win the war. That's your quotation.
Yeah.
And by the way, I have to say, one of the pleasures is too small a word, one of the important aspects of the book is that even somebody who's read a fair amount of the Second, I'm no military historian, but I've read a fair amount, there's an insight or a fresh perspective on every page. And so I come to this, I'm giving you a little more setup for this first question because it's so striking to me that if you've read what I've read and you're of my generation, you grew up thinking that the Germans were a military machine, and they were much to be feared. And you say the Axis powers were completely ill-prepared to win the war. Hitler, from the get-go, didn't know quite what he was doing. What's the argument there?
The argument was that if you're Japan and you've modernized and rearmed in the 1930s, then you're very powerful vis-a-vis Southeast Asia or Indonesia or China. Or if you're Italy, maybe you have more power than Somalia. Or if you're Germany and you have good roads and you have sources of supplies, you can run over your neighbors. If you preempt, all of these were surprise attacks. But if you want to fight a global war, which, as I said, 1941, that's what their arrogance led them into.
Right.
And it's going to be an existential war, and that's a fancy term for just saying you have to destroy the enemy, not have an armistice like World War I. Then you have to be able to reach the homeland of the enemy. And once the Soviets moved most of their industry across the Urals, Germany had no ability to get to them. From the very get-go, neither Japan nor Germany could reach Detroit. And even during the Blitz of late 1940,
The Blitz is the bombing attack over
bombing
London.
of London, there was greater Spitfire production, their signature fighter plane, than there was Bf-109, Germany's best fighter plane. So what I'm getting at is, if you want to start a global war, and they started it, and attack these countries, then you better have a 4-engine bomber, or if you're Germany, you better have an aircraft carrier fleet. They had neither. Japan did not have a 4-acre. And what did they spend their money on? The V2 and the V1, which in terms of how many marks were necessary to deliver a pound of explosive, were about 30 times more expensive than not only conventional bombing, which the Allies had 4-engine bombers when the war started, both Britain and the United, but even the B-29 program or the atomic bomb. They were as expensive or more expensive, and yet the latter really paid dividends.
Right.
So they didn't spend their money wisely, and they lived in a world of fantasy and romance. And after 1941, it caught up to them.
All right. I want to return to that fantasy and romance. That's the Axis powers. Here are the Allies. Why the Western world chose to tear itself apart in 1939 is not a story so much of accidents, miscalculations, and overreactions, as of the carefully considered decisions to ignore, appease, or collaborate with Nazi Germany by nations that had the resources and knowledge to do otherwise. Yeah. Close quote. Explain that.
The United States in World War I had delivered 2 million troops within 18 months to the soil of France and didn't lose one. They had that ability, believe it or not, in 1941, but even 40, if they had rearmed a little bit in the 30s. Britain started to rearm in 1938 and 39, and they really got going. And it was so successful that when the war started, Germany didn't realize that they were almost comparable in fighter production. But deterrence doesn't do you any good unless the enemy knows that. And Germany still thought that this was Britain of 1935 and not 39. In the case of the Soviet Union, Hitler himself said, had they told me they have already 2,000 T-34 tanks, which were better than every class of German tank, I wouldn't have invaded. What I'm getting at is that something shouldn't have happened. And by that I mean, if you take the assets of Britain and France alone in 1940, they were greater than Germany's. When Germany invaded France, they had less tanks, their air forces were no better, and they had fewer men than the democracies. Had the United States had a non-aggression pact or even an alliance with France and delivered soldiers there, Germany would have never invaded. Had Britain rearmed a little bit earlier and France a little bit earlier, they wouldn't have invaded. And if the Soviet Union had have not signed an non-aggression pact with Germany and assured it, there would be no Eastern Front, as was true in World War I, Germany would have never gone west. So it took Soviet collusion, American indifference or isolation, and British and French appeasement in the 30s to convince Germany of something that they should have never been convinced of, i.e. that they thought they were stronger militarily in terms of manpower and in terms of industrial capacity. They were not only not stronger than the eventual allies of the Soviet Union, United States, and Britain, they weren't even stronger than the two original allies of Britain and France. They had one thing going for them, and that is they looked at World War I as a tragedy that could be replayed with different results. In other words, if you were growing up in Germany in the 1920s and the word Great War came, it was, we should have won that. We were on their soil and we were stabbed in the back, so the myth went. But we were on the offensive and no Allied soldier ever set foot in Deutschland. If you were in the Allies, it was, we never want the Somme. We can't ever get back to the Verdun.
We won, but the price was too high.
We won. It was just so terrible. There were the brilliant war poets. If you were in the Netherlands, they renamed destroyers. They didn't use that term to fleet leaders. They thought it was too bellicose. If you were in France, you couldn't talk about they shall not pass at Verdun. Germany was bragging on their defeat, and the Allies were ashamed of their victory.
You quote Churchill, quote, this is Churchill now, German rearmament could have been prevented without the loss of a single life. It was not time that was lacking, meaning it was will that was lacking, right?
Yes, it was will. I mean...
So what is so, in the early chapters, as you describe how it began, it's so chilling and so hard to believe, but you argue it so compellingly, that the Second World War was a result of fantasy, willful fantasy on both sides.
It was. The Allies didn't realize their own capabilities. So they were talking in 1941, the United States, of maybe building a four-engine bomber, a B-17, which had been in production for maybe once every 2 days. They didn't realize that within 3 years they could build a better B-24 in 1 hour. And they built more airframes than all of the other allies and enemies combined. Their GDP at the end of the year, the American GDP, was larger than anybody else in the war put together. So they didn't understand fully their capability and their potential, and they underestimated their power, and the Axis always overestimated their capability. And so war is a laboratory, and what it does is it says, these are realities, and you have impressions about realities that are often false. So war is unnecessary, because if everybody just had deterrence and they knew exactly what everybody in this room, their relative capability is, you wouldn't fight. But fights take place
to discover
who's fine. So after 65 million people are killed, we come to the conclusion in 1945, wow, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain were much stronger than the Axis, which was clearly discoverable in 1939 and even 41.
Got it. You make the point the Axis is dominant right up through 1941 or so.
Yeah.
And tides shift. The Second World War is at the beginning of the war, the Axis powers appeared resolute, determined, and calculating under the leadership of strongmen, but by early 1943, the very opposite had proven true. So let's take briefly, you have a whole book here on it, but briefly, the first phase, how do the Germans do all that they do so quickly? There's a moment when they seem indomitable.
Absolutely. We got to remember one thing, that the Allied coalition of very disparate allies, I mean, British imperialism, American democracy, and Soviet communism,
right,
they all have one thing in common. They were either surprise attacked themselves or one of their allies, in the case of Poland and Britain,
right,
so that brings them in. So they don't, what I'm getting at is a lot of their victories were incumbent upon attacking, they meaning the Axis, unarmed or poorly armed adversaries, and they were surprise attacked.
This applies to Japan and Asia as well.
And so after 1941, there was no more opportunity for surprise attack. Everybody knew what the score was. Japan was in a war. It wouldn't do any good to surprise attack the United States. They didn't knock us out. Germany had surprise attacked the Soviet Union. It didn't work to knock them out. So now we were in a war where industrial capability and manpower. In 1 year, the Axis had redefined the war. They had gone from having about 180 million people versus about 70, 60 million left, maybe a few allies if we count the Empire and Britain, to 400 million people against them. And if you counted China and India, which had manpower that was used in various degrees on the Allies, you might have been up to 1 billion people.
Right.
And then if you look at GDP, they had gone from having a greater GDP than Britain to having a fraction of the Axis. So what was their race was, and they started to understand this, the race was superior morale, we're more ferocious, we're more savage, we believe in blood and soil, we've got to knock these guys out before they can get going. And they almost, for a moment, in late 1942, if you look at the map, from the Arctic Circle in Norway to when they took Tobruk in the summer of 1942, and from the Volga River in early 1942, the Wehrmacht was in the Caucasus Mountains, and they had climbed the highest peak and put their flag there all the way to the British Channel, and the Japanese controlled territory even larger, from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean, and from Manchuria all the way to off, Wake Island. And then it ran out of gas, because finally the Soviets, the Lend-Lease, the cooperation between the three allies, the industrial capacity of the United States, the overwhelming manpower, and the Soviet Union put 12.3 million people in uniform, and we put 12.1, and Britain put 6, and Germany only put 7. So what you're seeing is they were overwhelmed. So suddenly, let's just take some names. Guadalcanal, late 1942. The 1st Marine Division can fight the Japanese veterans from China just as well, but they had much more support and logistics. El Alamein, it turns a tide. Stalingrad turns a tide. And after that,
Kursk, isn't Kursk in
1943 turns a tide as well. But after Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht will not be able to mount an offensive.
Stalingrad's
and
the
after
key point.
Guadalcanal, the Japanese are not going to go on the offensive, and Midway as well. So then it was a question, what was the last 2.5 years of the war? It was a question of the Allies, unlike the first time in World War I, no armistice, no negotiations. Unconditional surrender was announced at Casablanca Conference. So what that mean? It meant it's pretty hard to go into those countries and kill, capture, disarm 15 million Japanese, Italian, Eastern European, and German soldiers, occupy or destroy their homelands, and change their political system. That was what the last 2 wars were, years were of the war about. That's very hard to impose an unconditional surrender, and yet we did it.
Right. So in the end, there's something almost a little unsatisfying about it. This notion that the Axis expands by surprise, surprise, surprise. Suddenly everybody's wide awake. And then what finally permits the Allies to win the war is not better generalship, it's not higher morale, it's not superior or more noble systems of government, it's just industrial production.
I think
that's not quite right, though, is it?
No, I don't think so. It was industrial production, and by that I mean 70% of the airframes were Allied, 90% of the aviation fuel was produced by the United States. But the key is that when you had the British Expeditionary Forces in North Africa, or you had the 1st Marine Division, or the 6th Marine Division, they fought as well as the Axis soldier. But they fought like Axis. They learned to fight like Axis, but the Axis never learned how to produce like Allies.
I see.
That was one thing. And then they had brilliant commanders, General Hama, Yamaguchi, von Manstein, Rommel, of course, Guderian. But we had, when Patton, and especially at the second, Nimitz, Halsey, these people were almost as good, if not better. But at the supreme leader, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, compared to Mussolini, who was buffoonish, and Hitler was delusional finally, and Tojo was just sort of an unimaginative bureaucrat. They had no strategic sense. And what that meant was the Allies did not get themselves into quagmires, such as losing an entire army in North Africa, which they did. That was bigger than Stalingrad, or going into the deep Ukraine and the Caucasus and losing the entire 6th Army, or having the entire Italian army destroyed in North Africa. They didn't, when they had setbacks, they were tactical mistakes, things like Tobruk or a Bridge Too Far campaign at Arnhem, but not, or the bombing campaign in the first year, but they were not elemental crisis that proved fatal. And they had so many greater margins of error if they had have done something so stupid. But it's very hard to fault Roosevelt and Churchill, because they made most of the big decisions of the war in a correct fashion.
All right, Russia, Victor. I'd like to spend a little time on Russia, because you spend quite a lot of time on Russia, and you make the point that Americans need to know about it. I'm quoting you. As a result of the Cold War, the Soviet war effort is often not given full credit in the West for its near virtuoso destruction of the German army. Near virtuoso destruction of the German army. Explain that.
3 out of 4 German soldiers were killed on the Eastern Front. And the price, we lost total about 450,000, depending on how we calibrate the losses. In Britain, about 420, and 50,000 civilians. Russia lost, Soviet Union, 27 million people, civilian and soldiers. But they did kill 3 out of 4 Germans, and they destroyed an army that was over 3 million people in strength. And it was a very strange partnership. We said, essentially, I don't know if it was so explicit, but we said, we will fight in Italy, we'll fight in North Africa, we'll fight in the Mediterranean, we will fly the skies of Europe and bomb, we will have 4-engine bombers, we will fight the Japanese alone, we being the British and the Americans. We'll go to Burma, we'll go to the Pacific, we'll have the B-29 program, we'll do all of these things. But you don't have to build a blue water neighbor, you don't have to have 4-engine bombers, we'll supply you with 20% of all your needs. However, you're going to tie down and destroy the best army in the world, which the German army was. And they did that. After the war, Stalin, remember, cut a deal with every single person, every single party in that war. He had a non-aggression pact with Hitler. He had a non-aggression pact with the Japanese. He had a semi-one with Italy. He had an agreement with us, and he had an agreement with the British. He tended to keep his word with the Axis, and he didn't keep his word with us. And so what I'm getting at is that there's a lot of reasons to be very angry at the Soviet Union. The World War II would not have started had they not had the non-aggression pact with Germany. That being said, when today...
We should just explain. The non-aggression pact with Germany, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Of August 23rd, 1939.
Hitler and Stalin agree they're going to leave each other alone, and they divvy Poland up.
They both hated because of the Versailles Treaty Poland, and they carved it up, and they made that deal 7 days before they invaded.
And then astonishingly enough, what's your view on this, by the way? The only man that Joseph Stalin ever really seems to have trusted was Adolf Hitler. Stalin really was taken by surprise when Hitler invaded
and
him.
Molotov said, famous quote, "We didn't deserve this," when he found out. And Hitler in turn said, if we had won, I would have hung Churchill, but I would have given a state to Stalin and let him, because he was a genius. They had a mutual admiration because they were very alike, much alike in some ways.
So historians, I'm quoting you again, historians still seek to sort out the degree to which the Soviets' catastrophe, 27 million dead, civilian and military, was a result of their own duplicity.
Yeah. Well,
how do you what do you mean by that, and how do you weigh that?
Just take
yourself?
one example,
Okay.
for sake of brevity. The Kiev pocket, they lost about 700,000 people by no surrender, not one step back orders by Stalin. So from June of 1941 to December, they intentionally ordered, I shouldn't say intentionally, they just ordered Soviet armies not to retreat.
When withdrawing into the interior was the only reasonable thing to do.
And when you were dealing with people like von Bock or Guderian or Rundstedt, who were masters at encirclement, they lost an entire 4 million person army. They lost 50...
Because Stalin was a bonehead.
Yes, 50 million people. Their population went from 180 down to about 130. They lost 1 million square miles. They should have been anybody else would have been knocked out of the war. France would have been, they didn't do that to France, and France quit in 6 weeks. But Stalin, the Russian people were a different type of people. They were, used to adversity and worse than adversity. And they rallied, and then the United States and Britain supplied them. And Stalin began to do something that Hitler didn't do. He said to himself, I've got brilliant commanders in Zhukov and Konev, and Hitler never understood what Rommel was trying to do in North Africa or what Guderian wanted to do. So he didn't trust he started to get more and more distrustful of his commanders, and Stalin, who had been like Hitler and trying to be a virtuoso supreme leader, started to delegate. And the tide started to change. But what I was getting at, too, is when we get angry at the Crimea, and we should, or Ukraine, we in the West don't say, well, wait a minute. The siege of Sevastopol cost the Russians 150,000 people in World War II. And the Ukrainian pocket was 750,000. So they do have claims, at least psychological, mystic, I don't know what they are, but they have claims on these territories that are a little bit different than us vis-a-vis Puerto Rico. And yet we're very defensive of the Caribbean. So I think we have to keep that in mind, how they view the Second World War.
The Second World War, as I'm quoting you one more time here on Russia. Russia helped to save the Allied cause.
Yes.
Yet the Allied war effort saved communism.
Yes, I think after the show trials and the Great Terror,
these are the 30s.
Starvations in the 30s, and especially the liquidation of the Soviet officer class, they had so weakened themselves, and they had so lost international public opinion, and the system was not working, that what happened in 1989 could have happened in the 40s without a war. But once the war occurred, the Soviets took on the mantle of anti-fascism. They fought heroically, they united the people, and they copied mass productive strategies of Washington and London, and they retooled their economy. And they were very successful, and that gave them a cachet that they otherwise didn't deserve.
I see.
Especially after the war, because we had a terrible propaganda. We had to say to the world, yes, Japan, Germany, and Italy were bad. They started World War II. They were fascist, but now they're the good guys. And the Soviets propaganda was, the war's still going on. We're still liberating people from fascism, whereas the United States and our imperialist enemies, Britain, have flipped and they've joined the Axis. And that was very hard to combat in the late 40s and 50s.
One more, while we're on the late 40s, one more question about the late 40s and 50s. The Red Army sweeps into, as best I can tell, it's the biggest invasion from the east since Attila.
Yeah.
So they sweep in, and Red Army is in place in much of Eastern Europe, and at Yalta, it doesn't matter. Is it true or is it not true that it really, Roosevelt surrendered Eastern Europe at Yalta, or is it simply the case the Red Army was already in place throughout Eastern Europe?
Yeah, I think it was Roosevelt was very naive, but if you actually look at the concessions he gave concessions out of naivete, and Churchill gave the same number of concessions out of realism. And the fact was,
we're not going to war again to push them back out.
Not with 350 divisions, with T-34 tanks, American boots, American ponchos, radios. And remember, they broke every agreement. And one thing, the Germans call it the silent Holocaust, because they had no claim on anybody's sympathy, but 13 million Germans that had been in East Prussia, to take one example, or parts of what is now the Czech Republic, they walked home. And they'd been there for 400 or 500 years. 13 million walked home. 2 million died.
Walked home meaning?
Back into
what we would think of as Germany proper.
And they lost 30% of their, Germany today has the same amount of people, 80 million, that they did in World War II, but nobody's talking about Lebensraum anymore. But they lost 30% of their territory. And that was ceded to pro-Soviet allies in Eastern Europe. And the Soviet Union was very careful that all of the land they stole when they were a partner of Hitler, the Baltic states and Eastern Poland, they kept. And they said, if you want to be nice to the Poles, then you take it out of Germany. You're not taking out of what we stole. And that was a tragedy that they came out a winner in geostrategic and geopolitical terms. They came out a loser in human terms because of the vast number of people who were killed.
Right. Victor Davis Hanson, author of The Second World Wars, will continue this discussion in a second program. But for now, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge on the Hoover Institution. Thank you. He farms 40 acres in the small town of Selma, California, and he's just published what may be the best history of the Second World War that you will ever read. Victor Davis Hanson joining us today. Uncommon Knowledge, now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. A classicist and historian, Victor Davis Hanson is the author of many books, including the classic study of the Peloponnesian War, A War Like No Other. Dr. Hanson's newest book, The Second World Wars, How the First Global Conflict Was Fought and Won. Now, Victor and I continue our conversation about this magnificent new book. The Second World Wars. Victor, one of the many pleasures of this book is that you provide counterfactuals, sort of what-ifs. Let's take a couple of those. Yeah. The Second World Wars, I'm quoting, could the Axis powers have incorporated their winnings and dug in? There was no reason why Hitler could not have reorganized Europe from the Atlantic to Moscow to ensure greater industrial production and conscripted armies as large as those of the Soviet Union. That Japanese-held Pacific and occupied Asia offered nearly as many natural resources and recruits as were available in North America and the British dominions, close quote. If Hitler had not attacked Russia, he could have consolidated his position in Europe and dominated the continent for who knows how long. And likewise, the Japanese, Mongolia, Southeast Asia, they didn't need to attack Pearl Harbor. Why didn't they consolidate?
And there were people who said just that. In the case of Germany, the general staff, there were people within the general staff who said, you know what, Britain, we may not be able to invade Britain, but Britain can't really do us damage. And the Americans will not intervene unless they're attacked. That was true. And the Soviet Unions are supplying us with all sorts of oil and wheat and precious metals. And we've won the war. They thought they won the war by April 1941.
They won the war for Europe.
Yes, they did, and they had the resources of today's European Union. But human nature being what it is, Hitler's idea was, well, wait a minute, I overran France in 6 weeks. In World War I, it took us 4 years, we only got 70 miles. Based on that calculus, 6 weeks will be 3 weeks into Russia because Russia collapsed in 2.5 years. France never did. I cracked the hardest nut first, and now Russia, like it was in 1917 and 18, will sue for peace in 6 weeks, meaning half the time that it took me in World War I. He had this ratio in his head. Russia is going to collapse in half the time that France did. France never did. So now France collapsed, so he said, well, it's got to be 3 weeks because it was 6 weeks. That was part of it. Part of it, he had not been defeated. In the case of Japan, it boggles the mind because here, all of the Pacific, we keep saying, well, we provoked them with an oil embargo. Nuts. I mean, they had shale oil in Indonesia right in their backyard. They had all of the rice of Southeast Asia. So all they have to do is they look at the map, and they did this in the beginning. They say, Vichy France doesn't exist. Vietnam, Cambodia, it's ours. Holland ceased to exist. It's off the map. Right. All of its colonies in Indonesia are ours. British, we can
including the oil operations.
Exactly. And they got some oil, but not enough because the Dutch had time to blow it up because of the war. But I'm getting at, and Malaysia, rubber, all they had to do was do two things. Do not touch the Philippines and do not touch Pearl Harbor. And they would have overran all the British, Dutch, and French, and they would have had all the necessary population base and resources they needed. They had one problem, and that is their supreme leadership, as we discussed, lived in a world of fantasy. They thought they were invulnerables, and they had all this idea in Italy of raza, the Franco idea that raza means that we're racially superior, or the Volk, or the Yamato, and Japan, whereas the Allies didn't quite have that idea, and they were more realistic. And then
Victor, were these leaders, Mussolini, Hitler, Tojo, and I guess Tojo wasn't a supreme leader in the same way. He had the war cabinet. It was more of a shared responsibility. Here they sit atop. Italy is a little more backward, but still, it was a modern country. Certainly Hitler and Tojo and the war cabinet in Japan sit atop what were, by the standards of the day, massive, industrial, complicated states, and they control them. And yet they overreach.
They overreach.
Were they nuts or were they evil? What is the motive?
They were both, and they had convinced themselves that the initial victories, in the case of Japan since 37, but the initial victories from 39 especially to 41 were such that they grew contemptuous of the resistance. And they said, if the great French army collapse, if the United States will watch London burn and do nothing, if the Chinese, we have half of China now, if the British can't even bolster Singapore, if the Americans at Pearl Harbor only have 3 carriers, even though we had the second largest fleet in the world, they logically developed a contempt. And the thing about deterrence is it doesn't really matter that the British fleet is the largest in the world and ours is the second largest, or that we have a capability within 3 years to build a bigger fleet than all the fleets in the world combined if you don't display that deterrence. And they thought, well, deterrence isn't really material, it's spirit. And we have Elan, and we've got a new paradigm where modern fascism marshals the state, it's technologically superior, and we didn't disabuse them of that. It's sort of like North Korea today telling us how powerful they are when they have no clue of what they're getting into with the United States, because we're sophisticated, humane people, and we don't want to display to North Korea what could happen. And that's very dangerous because deterrence is also perceptions as well as actual strength.
One more counterfactual, fascinating counterfactual. Again, I'm quoting from the Second World Wars. Quote, American commanders, this takes a little bit to set up, but I think it's fascinating. American commanders were indoctrinated in 2 tactical traditions, and you trace them both to the Civil War. One was made famous by Ulysses S. Grant, emphasizing finding the enemy, then controlling and destroying him through overwhelming firepower. There was also a complementary tradition of mobility, envelopment, and stripping an enemy's ability to make war by destroying his infrastructure and morale, and that tradition is made famous by Sherman and his march to the sea. Okay, had the U.S. Army utilized its singular, I'm quoting you again, utilized its singular motorized mobility and tactical air power in the manner that Patton's Third Army had used it to cover its flanks, and then adopted a Sherman-esque attitude toward bypassing more resistance and conducting encirclements, the war, in theory, might well have ended before 1945. Patton is all about mobility, and he drives to the south and could have gone through, could easily have taken Prague, could have gone up to Berlin, and Eisenhower says, no, we advance on a front steadily, grinding.
And it's tragic because...
So how would you...
Well, George Patton, he had Trumpian characteristics. He was a blunderbuss, and he said things he shouldn't have said, and people confused that lack of discipline with a lack of talent. He was an authentic military genius, but we put him on ice, remember, from July of 43 to 44, where after the slapping incidents, we didn't have those talents in the planning of Normandy. But once we actually did do Normandy and we gave him Third Army, he didn't advance according to the plan. He was the furthest from Germany, and yet he advanced the fastest, and people said, well, there's gaps in our front. He's going too fast. And he was begging them to see that air power had changed that. With P-47s and P-38s, he had an ability to protect his flanks. And the Sherman tank, and the M1, he had really a great deal of confidence in their durability, their easy use. And people were saying, we're going to see a Tiger one day. And there's only 600 Tigers. Who cares about a Tiger? We have air power. So he was way ahead of his time, and we tend to do that in the United States. If a person is not considered sober and judicious, we equate that with a recklessness or a lack of discipline with incompetence. He was absolutely competent. He was brilliant. He spoke French. He read German. Mm-hmm. He was an intellectual, and that was something. But in the Pacific, we had people like Chester Nimitz, Spruance, Halsey that did the same thing as Sherman and Patton. They skipped islands. They skipped Rabaul. They skipped over to Iwo Jima, into Okinawa, Tarawa, and they cut the entire Japanese empire off from its supplies without having to invade each one of these. MacArthur did to a lesser extent. Well, he probably should have bypassed the Philippines, but there was that tradition that you don't want to get head-to-head with a fanatical enemy like Grant did in the summer of 1864, whereas Sherman went around the flank in Atlanta, then the March of the Sea, and into the Carolinas. Mm-hmm. There was great argument in the U.S. military about hitting them head-on versus the Sherman-esque, Patton-esque, Nimitz approach, where we have so much more capability, logistical and industrial, and we have more mobility, we have air power, sea power. We can cut them off without having to fight them because they're 19th century in their way they fight, right, in the sense that they're very ferocious and they're extremely good soldiers.
And you mentioned Patton, who could have swept around down to the south. Churchill, we have cables. Churchill begged Eisenhower and then went over his head and went straight to FDR, begged them to let Montgomery go across the north and get to Berlin. Part of Churchill's calculation, as I recall, was he wanted to get to Berlin before the Red Army did.
Yes, he did. It was one of the tragedies of the Normandy placement of forces that of the Allied armies, the quick shot into the Ruhr Valley, once you landed in the North Beaches at Normandy, it was only 500 miles to get straight, less than that even, to go right through the Netherlands into the Ruhr. And you had the sober, judicious, professional, I don't want to say plotter because Montgomery was a very good organizer, but he wasn't a cutter. He wasn't slash, not a slasher. And then you had the person who had that ability and you put him to the south. Not, he was still northern central France, but he had the longest 800-900 miles, and that wasn't part of the plan. He was supposed to secure, in the other direction, the Atlantic port. So had he been to the north, he would have got into the Ruhr very quickly, I think.
One more on this counterfactual. Had Roosevelt been as suspicious of Stalin's murderous gulag and expansionary plans as he was sometimes of Churchill's effort to preserve Britain's colonial possessions, the United States might have been better prepared for the Cold War. What might Roosevelt have done?
Well, Roosevelt basically said to Stalin, or I shouldn't say Roosevelt, but his envoys said, we don't approve of communism, but we understand where you're coming from, that the imperial colonial world is over with, and that we're going to support you full heart. Churchill said, it's not over with. We can decolonize if we have to, but we have a humanizing mission abroad, and people under British colonies are much different than the Soviet people under Soviet communism, and that didn't appeal to us. So when we were giving aid and the British were giving aid, the British were thinking—
To the Soviets.
Yes. They were thinking, what does this do when the German army disappeared? And the Americans, in typical American fashion, were sort of, let's be puritanical. How can you even think of that? The Soviets are our allies. We're fighting against this horrible fascism and Nazism. We don't want to think of the post-war ramification. Where Churchill was always saying, do you really— he was looking at 500 years of history and saying, when you destroy Germany, then you empower Russia. Germany is the continental buffer between Western Europe and Russia, no matter what the political system is. And the Americans thought, you know, that's an old game. We're not going to listen to your— yeah, we're a new people. We're democratic. This is the future of the United Nations, and we're all going to live in peace. And the Soviets and the British and us will police the world, and we're going to run this on principles of equality and fairness. And Stalin, I mean, to him, that was ludicrous.
All right. The moral questions. The Allies sought not merely to end the war on useful terms, but to demand that the Axis powers submit to unconditional surrender, which you call, quote, a historically rare objective of most wars, close quote. So even today, you will hear it argued a lot that if only we had not called for unconditional surrender, we could have reached terms with the Japanese much earlier. There were cables between, I think this has been substantially, but there are cables we picked up that the Japanese were looking for terms of surrender. That Hitler may be a different case, but even with Hitler, you could have come to some arrangement earlier. Yeah. And that lives were lost needlessly because Roosevelt and Churchill, Stalin as well, but Roosevelt and Churchill, it was these two deeply humane men who decided in Casablanca, as you say— Stalin wasn't at Casablanca— they decided to insist upon terms of unconditional surrender. Yeah,
and we have to, as historians, we have to look at what the world that they looked at, not as we look at post facto. And they were looking at the Versailles Treaty, and they said that combined the worst of both traits in human nature. We were punitive in the sense of rhetorically we blamed Germany, but we did not divide Germany, we did not occupy it, we did not invade with occupation troops. And we created the myth that they had been sold out by Jews or socialists while they were in someone else's territory. So this time around, we're not going to do that. Second thing is, they understood that every time Germany had made a peace agreement, whether it was the Franco-Prussian War or the September program, the design in World War I in September, they thought they were going to take France, or the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that knocked out Russia in World War I, or what they were envisioning after World War II when they won, they were pretty barbaric. And so they said, you cannot deal with these fascist countries, and you can't have an armistice like we did with World War I. That was a green light to World War II. So this time around, we're going to defeat, we're going to humiliate, we're going to occupy, and we're going to rebuild these countries into consensual societies. So for all the effort that was involved, and we still have troops in all three countries.
All these years later.
By giving women the right to vote, to take one example in Japan, or land redistribution in Japan, we created peaceful, humane societies. I don't think that would have been possible with an armistice. But today, I mean, for all our criticisms of Japan and Germany and Italy, they are three of the most humane countries in the world, and they're strong U.S. allies. And that was a direct result of the vision of Roosevelt and Churchill. But it came at a cost. And had we had an armistice, we probably would have been able to cut a deal with Hitler and Tojo in 1943 or 4, but we would have been at war with them in a cold peace in the 50s. Forever. I think it would have been like the first, second, third Punic War, or what we see in the Middle East with the 48, 56, 67, 73, 2006 war. It's a bellum interruptum. And they didn't want that, and they were willing to pay the extra. And they had societies that had been surprise attacked, and generations of American and British and Soviet citizens that were willing to pay that price.
Aerial bombing. You note that Britain and the United States dropped 30 times as much tonnage on Germany as Germany dropped on Britain. And with regard to Japan, quote, the March 9 to 10, 1945 napalm firebombing of Tokyo remains the most destructive single 24-hour period in military history,
Yeah.
close quote. And then, of course, we have the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the argument is that the Allies violated one of the most fundamental tenets of just war theory by targeting civilians.
Yes.
Never, ever, ever is it permissible to target non-combatants. That is immoral in and of itself. To which Victor Davis Hanson answers,
Well, they had a point. Curtis LeMay said that if we'd lost the war, he was the architect of the fire raids, he would be tried and convicted as a war criminal by the victorious Japanese. But everything has a utilitarian foundation to the argument. So we had developed the B-17 and the B-24 on a false premise. The fortress, the B-17 flying fortress, could fly in formation, it could knock down fighters, it could go at 1,200 miles, 1,000 miles into enemy territory, it could devastate. We found out by 1943 that that was not true. The Norden bomb site was not that accurate. It was too cloudy over Germany. The best pilots and planes in the world were Focke-Wulf 190s. We didn't have sufficient, and we were butchered, 40,000 people killed. The British
shot out of the sky.
Shot out of the sky. The great tragedy of the World War II, from our point of view, the British learned that they weren't going to do that. They called it area bombing, and they used more they didn't have napalm. We developed napalm, but they did have incendiary. And they discovered, after losing 40,000, even with great planes like the Lancaster, that they could not quite knock out Germany. So by 1944, this effort was in crisis. They had some dividends. They made Germany bring back 10,000 88mm platforms from Russia that were anti-tank guns to use as flat guns, but nevertheless, they were in a stasis. They couldn't really know what to do. And then they hit upon the idea, we're going to get fighter escorts and we're going to area bomb transportation hubs, fuel depots.
Going low.
Going lower. And then same thing in Japan. Curtis LeMay said the B-29 is a $2 billion program, bigger than the Manhattan Project. It has got no results. It's too high. It's at 30,000 feet. There's a jet stream. It misses the target. I want to take them low at 5,000 feet and use the jet stream. They'll come in at 400 miles an hour almost. They'll drop napalm. They don't have to be accurate. The same idea that had worked in Europe. And the idea was not quite that you're bombing civilians only, but you can't hit a target. You don't have the expertise, and the pre-war propaganda that you could drop a bomb into a pipe is completely
ridiculous.
Fabricated. So what we're going to do is we're going to burn everything to burn out the rail yard, or to burn out the coal to oil plant, or to burn out the zero factory. And it was true, but they took a level of collateral damage that was astonishing. Now, they would say to us, give us the most optimistic number of Italian, I shouldn't say that word, it's an amoral term, but give us the most, your greatest estimate of civilians that were killed in Japan, Germany, and Italy, and it would be somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million.
Right.
And they would say, we were fighting a people that by 1945 were killing 20,000 people in Asia, the Japanese.
20,000 people per
day, per day, in places like, and the war itself, 27,000 people were killed every day of this 6-year war. 6 million were killed in Auschwitz. And then they would say, as Bomber Harris, they reaped
the British general.
Yes,
the British Air
Harris
Force.
said they reaped the wind and they're going to sow the whirlwind, quoting biblical scripture. And his point was, they started the war. They surprise attacked us. They set up death camps. They're killing prisoners. The SS has an atrocious record in the Soviet Union. It's a little rich for them to say that we have to pinpoint targets when we know that we don't have that ability. So what are you going to do when the Soviet Union is losing 10,000 men a day, and they say, where's the second front? And and we say, well, we're North Africa, maybe Italy. So that's not enough. How are you going to stop 100 divisions coming and reinforcing? And we said, we'll start bombing. And the idea was we're going to open a second front through bombing.
Right.
And
second front in the air.
when you talk to people today, if you talk to Chinese citizens, diplomats, consuls, or you talk to people in Indonesia or Southeast Asia, I don't think I've ever, and I've read a lot of the literature, I don't think you ever see an argument that the United States was cruel and inhumane for bombing Japan. It's usually the other way around. I wish they had bombed earlier. For myself and you and all Americans, it's something that I will just end with this comment that the fire raids were really much more destructive than the atomic bombs. We got to remember that the war ended May 8th, 9th in Europe. There was a largest bombing fleet in the world was in Europe. So we had about 10,000 idle B-17, B-24, and British Lancaster was a superb plane, plus two-engine middle bombers, B-25s and 26. We had taken Okinawa and declared secure on July 2nd. So Curtis LeMay was building 5,000-foot runways. We had 2,000 B-29s on order that were arriving to supplement the 2,000 from the Marianas. In LeMay's mind, I have a 10,000 plane, four-engine bombers at not 3 missions a week from the Marianas, 1,600 miles away,
Right.
2 a day from Okinawa. My only problem was enough napalm. So he would have burned down all of Japan.
Right.
So the actual atomic bomb saved not so much an invasion, which LeMay said we wouldn't have done, but we would have created a firestorm that I think we would be regretting today. So the atomic bomb stopped that. And we killed a lot of Japanese, 500,000, but we didn't invade the country. And there were about 7 million Japanese soldiers. There were 7,000 kamikaze planes, and we avoided that through air power. And there is an irony that Japan was not as willing in the post-year wars to come to terms with its criminal behavior in World War II, as was Germany and Italy,
Right.
simply because we did not invade and their territory was not fought over. It was reduced by air power, and then the occupation was not a fought over, contested occupation. And so they had a little bit more leeway under the MacArthur proconsulship than did Germany and Italy.
Victor, last questions here. You grew up, as you write in the book, you grew up in your ranch, the family ranch in Selma, in the Central Valley of California, hearing firsthand accounts of the Second World War from your father and uncles. First of all, tell us, why are you named Hanson?
Well, my father's first cousin, his mother died in childbirth, and his father was blinded in a farming accident. So he grew up with my father, and they were inseparable. And they went to University Pacific under Alonzo Stagg and played as ends on the football team. They joined the Marine Corps. Family lore gets hazy here. Somebody hit a Marine officer. They were big Swedes. And one of them had to take the blame, and the military said either you're going to get kicked out of the Marine Corps, or we're going to fix you, Hanson. We're going to send you to this new B-29 program where everybody gets killed. We heard it's just the worst thing in the world in Nebraska. So they kind of decided that, I think my father was the one they hit the person. So Victor went on the 6th Marine Division and fought.
Victor's your uncle?
Yes, and he fought the atrocious battle in Okinawa, and he was killed on the last day of Sugarloaf Hill. And when I wrote a book once, Ripples of Battle, I was wondering what happened, and one of the people who in his 90s read the book and said, I have his ring. And he said,
Really?
When he was killed on the last day, he was a big Swede and we couldn't bring him down. His hands swelled, so we cut off the ring. And when I got back, I called your grandfather, and in broken Swedish, he said, I don't want to talk about it. So it's on my mantle. So he sent it to me.
Oh, my goodness.
And then my father, and the irony is that he went to the B-29 program, went over to Tinian, and he flew 40 missions as a central fire control. Of the 16 planes in a squadron, I think all but 2 were shot down or engine failure crashed, replacement crews. And so the person who was supposed to die lived, and the person who had a better chance of living died.
So your dad named you Victor.
And he said, I remember him saying to me, it's going to be very hard. You've got a real burden, because he was an all-star athlete and he was killed. I don't know if you can live up to it, but you got to try.
So Victor, you heard these stories from participants. My father was in the war as well, so I have some firsthand accounts. You have kids, now you're a grandfather. How do you convey, I don't know how to put the question other than to put it this way. How do you make them believe? How do you make them understand that this happened?
Yeah, that's why I tried to write the book, because I asked myself that same day, when I go to downtown Palo Alto, or I go to New York, or out on my farm, and I see the security, the prosperity, everything we have. And I look at the world abroad and I see, you know, democratic government all over Europe and Asia and all of these miracles going on. I say to myself, none of this would happen if it wasn't for these people in the United States and their counterparts in Britain, Australia, Canada, and the Soviet Union as well. And I think, wow, they were willing to give up everything for some idea. And I asked myself in bouts of melancholy, was it worth it? If they came back and they looked at our culture today, was this what it was all for? Is this what dying in Okinawa was for when you're 22? Or getting blown up in a B-29 when you're 18? I hope it was. So I think we have to take a deep breath and stop looking at history as melodrama, where we go back and look at the past and use the value system of the present to pick winners and losers. History's tragedy, and we should really instead say, given the material constraints put upon them, and given what they knew at the time, how they did what they did in World War II is a miracle, and we are indebted every day of our lives to them. And we need to start, I think, honoring people of the past who did things I'm afraid to say I'm not sure I could do, and my generation could do. When I was 21 years old, I was in graduate school studying Greek. When my father was 21, he had ear infections, sinus infections, and he was in a B-29 high above Japan, and emergency landed in Iwo Jima, and almost everybody was killed. And he got the highest medal of the Air Force, a Distinguished Air Medal, for taking a 500-pound napalm bomb with his hands that was locked in the bomb bay and throwing it out. And I can't think of anything I've done in my entire life like that. I think that's true of our whole generation. In Vietnam, people were very courageous as well in Korea, but I think this generation owes a lot to the generations that came. And this is why I get so depressed with these contemporary controversies where people don't want to do this, or they don't think they have to honor the flag. They don't understand that somebody just handed them a country, and what they think, wow, it's this ism or this ology, and it's not good because it's not perfect, and they don't understand what they started with. The alternative, that generation said we just have to be better than the alternative. The alternative was Japanese Holocaust, German Holocaust, and what the Italians did in Africa, it was a Holocaust, and yet we didn't do that. And so we say, well, we weren't perfect, therefore we weren't good. No, we were very good, what we did in World War II, and we need to remember it.
Victor Davis Hanson, author of The Second World Wars, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thank you.